Welcome to Talking Feds One-on-One, deep dive discussions with national figures about the most fascinating and consequential issues defining our culture and shaping our lives. I'm your host, Harry Littman. Welcome to another Talking Feds One-on-One. There is lots of talk these days around the subject of pardons. President Biden's of his son Hunter, the possibility of a wholesale kind of set of prospective pardons or protective pardons. We can talk about the name. Trump's avowal that he will, from early on in office, issue pardons of the 1-6 marauders. So I wanted to get a better fix on both the specifics and the general, and there's only one place to go. That would be Kim Wehle. She's a professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law, and you may well have seen her because she's a legal contributor for ABC, writes regularly for Politico, The Atlantic, and The Bulwark. But Kim was a former AUSA and also an associate independent counsel in the Whitewater investigation, so has sort of rich and broad experience and author of many books as a professor, the most recent being Pardon Power, How the Pardon System Works and Why. Kim, thanks a lot for being with us.
Thanks for inviting me, Harry. Happy to be here.
Okay, let's try to exploit your expertise a little before cutting to the chase of the current issues. Where's the pardon power kind of emerge from? Is it in every liberal democratic society? Is it always with the executive? What's its core and origin?
Its core and origin goes back to ancient Babylonian texts, the Code of Hammurabi, and of course, it traces through the Roman Empire. Jesus of Nazareth was denied a pardon by Pontius Pilate.
So that Barabbas gets it instead.
Correct.
That's a part. Got it. Okay.
Correct, because on the Roman tradition, on the Passover, the populace could decide on a pardon. So
kind of like the Thanksgiving turkey.
Yeah, gave birth to the Christian religion. It's hard to imagine something more transformative and crucial and important than the notion of the pardon. And of course, it went through common law England. The king could pardon, but that came about really because there was no criminal justice system, and most justice was meted out between private warring factions, kind of like the Hatfields and McCoys, and eye for an eye. If you kill my brother, I'll turn around and kill you. And then enter this concept, I think under Henry II, of the divine right of kings. The king says, no, actually, any offense against one of my subjects is an offense against me. So I can, at my own discretion, issue mercy. The idea is a pardon is forgiveness to sort of stop that process in theory. That's the concept. That's the idea, is the criminal justice system is incomplete, right? No jury trials for hundreds of years in England, no 4th, 5th, 6th Amendment rights, no appeals, those kinds of things. So, and most offenses carry the death penalty. That's the idea. And it was pretty much adopted with almost no constraints by the framers of the Constitution on this notion that, the wise executive needs to be the grown-up in the room sometime when the other levels of government inflict unfair punishment.
Got it. And let's talk about that sometime, because by the time of the framers, of course, we have all kinds of rights. They're embedded and formalized in the Constitution. And we go to a lot of trouble to try to get it right and to have a sentencing system that at least provides for relatively merciful treatment. So, and as you say, in its origins, there weren't the same kinds of full-bodied trial protections. So I take it, however, it was really never a question. We were going to have it. So let me just ask, was there ever any idea that it would be other than through the executive and other than, for whatever reason, the executive deemed meet?
There was. At the time of the framing of the Constitution, the king had his pardon power restrained by Parliament in minor ways. And there was a big debate for years between Parliament, a jousting, a tug of war, and the Enlightenment thinkers, who of course influenced the framers, really thought this was too much power. So at the Constitutional Convention, there were proposals to have Senate have to weigh in or approve pardons. There was a proposal to exempt pardons for treason, but ultimately Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, I think, prevailed on this idea that there just needs to be someone with unilateral authority to address injustices, and it's better to put it in one person than in a Congress, because that person's exercise of judgment is something we can trust. And I argue, back then the framers knew each other. They were all white males with money. They're the only ones who could vote. And they sort of passed these jobs around with this brand new United States of America, the federal government, right? Supreme Court justice one day, president the next day. And I think they really sort of trusted each other as being in a position to protect the importance of this massive power. They were aware of the threat that it could be used abusively, but they didn't buy it.
And did they at all? I meant to already be moving on, but your answers are so interesting, and I can't stop myself. When they talked in a cautious way or with concern, did they raise paradigms of what would be, even if permissible, abusive pardons? Was the worry about cronyism? Was the worry about mercy to someone who didn't deserve it? What were the kind of signposts they were worried about?
It was worry about too much power in the president, and the president could commit crimes and cover them up or get away with it, essentially. That if the president becomes, and these are my words, Congress, the executive branch, and the judge all in one place, that's a recipe for abuse. I mean, and of course, that's what the American Revolution was fought over, was to throw off the yoke of an unlimited monarchy where the power came from the divine. That was the idea, right? If you slayed the old
divine
king.
Right of kings. Yeah.
Yeah, the divine right of, God wanted you to be king. And that's this idea of, we have this concept of sovereign immunity. Even it made its way into American law that you can't sue the federal government unless they waive that immunity from suit. The concept is it derives from the government. The king can do no wrong. So that is the problem that carries forward to today. I know we're going to talk about the Hunter Biden pardon, but I think what people in this debate we've been having now, I think for the first time since I've been thinking about this, people are upset about Joe Biden's supposed throwing off of norms and violation of the rule of law. Those are critiques of the actual pardon power itself, which go back to, again, England, medieval England.
Well, yeah, very good. And so when we will move there, and by the way, congratulations. It's not often that you move to the academy and you're writing about something that all of a sudden the world comes around to you. But let me ask, it's considered a kind of article of faith or a common conception that the pardon power is without limits. And I just want to push on that a little. We know from the Supreme Court that you can't bring criminal charges for certain pardons by the president, but would it be, for example, lawful, as we understand the pardon power, to do it as a straight up bribe? I'll, give me $100,000, I'll give you the pardon. Are there any limits that we are aware of? Again, not necessarily justiciable, not necessarily criminalizable, but just, is it truly, as best we know, anything goes?
I think there's a before Trump versus U.S., the immunity decision, and after Trump versus U.S. So I outline in the book a number of restraints on the pardon power to push back on the mythology that's been floating around forever that it's absolute. I mean, I started getting into civic education and public facing work when I wrote my first opinion editorial 8 or 9 years ago in response to an article in the New York Times that said the pardon power is absolute. Like, well, no, it isn't. Actually, if the president were to come out and pardon people just based on their race, only white people get pardons, there'd be an equal protection challenge, right? So the Supreme Court...
Well, wait, that's my question. There would be a challenge? Like, who would bring it and how? Is it that a prosecutor would try to... Well, so go ahead.
Yeah, so great question. The reason we don't have a lot of law around pardons is because I think the question you're getting to, who has standing to challenge a pardon? And really, historically, who has standing to challenge a pardon is someone who gets a pardon, doesn't like the pardon, right? There's something about the pardon they're unhappy with. So to your other question, are there constraints? Yes. In a case called Burdick versus United States, a recipient of a pardon did not want to accept it because the pardon was given with the idea that once there's a pardon, they would not have the right to refuse to testify under the Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination. The recipient said, I don't want it. I reject it. It went into the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, you can't force a pardon on someone. The Fifth Amendment right supersedes the power of the president, for example. And there are others. The Supreme Court has said in dicta, you can't pre-pardon someone for a crime. In the future, the action hasn't even happened. The Supreme Court has said a pardon cannot force the United States Congress to reimburse you for a criminal financial penalty because that would interfere with Congress's prerogative to control the power of the purse, right? So to answer your original question, there's nothing special about the pardon power that takes it outside the separation of powers, right? The Constitution says the president shall be commander in chief, but we know there are statutory constraints on the military, for example. Somehow the pardon power, as a horse that got out of the barn, and it went crazy, and it went even crazier. Now, Trump versus U.S. To your question about pardons, I was listening to that oral argument, and counsel for the government was asked about pardons and just gave away the store. I was sitting there listening like, what? Basically said, yeah, it's absolute. It made its way into the opinion that it's, quote, core, unquote. That is, there's no dispute that you cannot second guess or criminally prosecute a president for any pardon, right? Now, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, in her concurring opinion, said, wait, what about bribes? Because not only did the court say pardons are core and certain powers are core, but the court said you can't look into the reason why a president does something that's core. So you can't look into the reason for why they issue a pardon. So take a bribe. I'll give you, $100 million if you give me a pardon, a quid pro quo. So Barrett's like, you've basically said the money part, like the rationale for the pardon, which is the bribe, is off the table. The way I explained it, this is a prosecutor. It's like a chocolate chip cookie recipe. If you can't put the baking soda in there, you're not going to have any cookies, right? If you can't have, both sides of the bribe. And the court said, and also you can't get the evidence of that. The court made clear that anything relating to the reasons for the pardon, you cannot actually get before a jury. And the court said, yeah, but the fact of the pardon would still be public. And so you could still use the public part to make the case. So maybe, maybe not. I think the other question is what prosecutor would even bother because it's so difficult.
And we'll get to that in a moment because there may be a new answer in town about that. I just want to make all really good points. And the fact that there is an important distinction between whether you can charge a crime and whether something's illegal. And I also, just to stitch up this verdict point, I think that many people, actually, I'll ask your opinion, think that the facts there were pretty unusual, and that the more recent holding, including a circuit court case from a couple years ago, says you don't have to accept a pardon. It's not a requirement, even though you can, in that case, deny acceptance of one. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's that 10th Circuit case, Lawrence, it's called. The verdict case, I think you're right. I think that
1815 also, or something, right? Verdict,
the better construction of verdict is that the rights of the defendant to reject the pardon override the rights of the president to grant the pardon. That is really, I think, an opinion about the rights of the individual defendant. But there is that, what we call dicta. There's that language that's floating out there that gets hijacked and creates this impression that you're accepting guilt. I mean, Harry, think about the posthumous pardons. Bill Clinton pardoned the first African-American member. I think he was a cadet at West Point. Then he was the first African-American military officer. And he was court-martialed for bogus reasons. And later, many years after his death, he was formerly an enslaved person. Bill Clinton posthumously pardoned him on the theory that, hey, you're innocent, right? So you can have pardons that actually are about establishing innocence. So how could they possibly always be about establishing guilt?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And in part, I think you need it because social views change. So the similar Obama's wholesale pardon really wasn't about whether the recipients had been misjudged at the time. It was that our judgment had changed over the course of time. Another one that I think Lenny Bruce was pardoned posthumously, and the things he says would be tame on HBO today, but he'd been busted repeatedly. Okay, but so I agree with you that it's just mistaken, notwithstanding Trump versus U.S., to say there's anything goes and there's no way of violating the pardon power or transgressing it, even though it could be really hard to physically, as it were, challenge in court. So let's cut to the three chases, as it were. You and I think, were on record as being supportive of the Hunter Biden pardon. And one more step back, which is, given the way you've put it, there's always going to be political considerations that might make it imprudent or whatever, but that's different from legal restrictions. But you saw the Hunter Biden pardon, for which President Biden has actually, has gotten hell, as being pretty down the middle of the traditional use of the pardon power. Can you explain?
Yeah, I think you and I are in the minority on that, in terms of not criticizing it. I came out even before the pardon.
But so we had to have been right.
Yeah, we had to have been right. But I say this because I was surprised by the outrage. And we can talk about the corrupt pardons, right, in the Trump administration. But I just want to clarify, to your point earlier, what's the point of the pardon? The point of the pardon is mercy. There's also something called amnesty pardons, which the court in Burdick makes a distinction between amnesty and mercy on an individual. So an amnesty pardon could be Jimmy Carter's pardoning of draft dodgers. And there's, believe it or not, there's still a link on the DOJ website for accepting that amnesty pardon. And it's still live all these years later. So it kind of also debunks this idea you got to accept it for it to be real. And so mercy pardons, probably okay. Amnesty pardons, probably okay. All constitutional. What are the pardons we might not like? Okay, what are the pardons that totally constitutional, but maybe make us a little bit queasy? How about pardons for people that are violent and will go on and commit violent crimes? Donald Trump pardoned somebody for participating in the murder of a police officer in upstate New York. This summer, he went on to engage and was convicted of domestic violence. So I think presidents, governors have to be careful about pardoning people that will be violent.
And by the way, that's a very strong guideline. You look at, there are guidelines in DOJ. Trump has ignored them, but there's a pardon attorney and different. And I think that's pretty universal. You do not pardon people who have committed violent crimes. So that's somehow a superseding factor. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a matter of discretion, but you think about it, you want to protect the public, and a pardon wipes out all the work of everybody else, the jury, the prosecutor, the witnesses, the judge, the appeals, right, everything, the investigators, even Congress, who decided what's a crime and what's not a crime. And there's no due process, meaning you can't challenge a pardon. Somebody who doesn't get a pardon can't come and say, hey, no, that's no fair. I should get one too. There's no way to do any of that. So I think if you're going to undo all of that, you better be really careful that you're not disturbing all the work of the criminal justice system, which is really about not only making sure someone, gets their just due if they commit a crime, but also the community is safe. So that's one, I think, just red line that shouldn't be crossed, or should be crossed very carefully. Sometimes governors in particular get it wrong because they do more pardons than presidents, just because there's more states and more, state law crimes.
Yeah, you said that pretty quick, but I do want to underscore 90% plus of convicts are convicts under state crimes, and often this goes, and they're my understanding is there's a little bit of difference, including on process, about how clemency works in different states, but we're focused on the feds. So
well, and there's a big difference actually in that. In the research that I did, there's only a handful of states in the District of Columbia, like 3 to 5, where the governor has the kind of power the president does.
Right.
And most of them, it's constrained. There's a committee. There's all these other limits. There's not this king-like power in a single person. Okay, so we don't like violent crimes, pardons of people that committed violent crimes. Then you've got, I would say, self-dealing pardons of cronies with money and power and access that might give you a bunch of money to your presidential library, for example. This Bill Clinton got in trouble for pardoning a guy by the name of Mark Rich, a financier, massive tax evader. His wife gave $450,000 to the Clinton library. He got in a bunch of trouble. Congress investigated it. The Southern District of New York investigated it. I mean, so there was a time.
I didn't know that. I knew there were hearings with Podesta. So SDNY investigated it, what, as a possible obstruction of justice case?
I think it was a quid pro quo type bribery question. It was Mary Jo White. Nothing came of that. But that's, again, the before and after of Trump versus the U.S. There's no way. I just think now we're in a different world where even that wouldn't happen because there's more of an expectation that pardons are protected.
And what about like 19th century and before, this kind, you would think that would be something that had been done in the past. Do we have crony pardons?
We certainly did under common law England. The king did it for sure. I think in American history, the most, which is really my last category of problematic pardons, are self-protecting pardons. I think the most prominent one was George H.W. Bush pardoning Caspar Weinberg and others in connection with Iran-Contra, because the thought is that they were going to start investigating him and he had his hands, unclean in that regard, but you pardon them all, they're silenced, you get off. So that's the last part. So back to Hunter Biden. Let me make my case. Okay. Yeah, so on the good pardon, on the mercy pardon, you could say, okay, he didn't technically qualify under DOJ guidelines, which are optional because you have to wait 5 years until after you serve your sentence, even under DOJ, to be eligible. But he's not the first guy that, Trump did it a lot, bypassed DOJ. But mercy pardons. Okay, this is a person convicted by a jury of not checking a box about his addiction in purchasing a handgun and owning that handgun for 11 days. And he didn't check that box. He was in a downward spiral because his brother Beau had just died of brain cancer, right? Eric Holder, former attorney general, Lindsey Graham, Senator Lindsey Graham. People have publicly said if it weren't for the fact that he was a Biden, no one would bother. That's such a low-level offense. And frankly, where's the Second Amendment cavalry running around saying, wait, that's his right. He shouldn't be prosecuted for not checking a box on a gun application. I mean, we've seen the pro-gun lobby just an opinion Rahimi last year, argued that domestic violence abusers shouldn't be kept from their guns even when they've got a record.
And the basic point, Kim, some people disagree with that, but literally nobody disputed that point that, but for his last name, he wouldn't have had this penalty. So that to me was always pivotal. It wasn't a factual dispute. It was some strange kind of strange, you understand, father, son, but still, it didn't go to the core of what a pardon's about, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, well, you could, if you separated that he had the name Biden, you could say, listen, this guy shouldn't be in prison for something like this. And then there are the tax crimes in California, $1.4 million. He had paid them back with interest. I think Roger Stone had a $2 million tax on, liability. Then he worked out a deal. So if he didn't have the name Biden, he might not have been targeted and prosecuted. Joe Biden could have called off those prosecutions, could have told Merrick Garland to stand down. Now, would that have been a violation of norms? Would there have been a huge political pushback post-Watergate? Yes, but he had the constitutional authority. He didn't. He let his son go through that process, his family, his grandchildren go through the trial, all that. So from a mercy standpoint, he's not, I think, off the table as someone who would be eligible. And he's not violent. There's no question that he would commit violence. This is not, Joe Biden covering up something from himself. This is not Joe Biden getting big donations from a crony. And I think the last piece, Harry, is that this is when a moment where Donald Trump is promising and it's taking steps to use the Department of Justice and the FBI for revenge prosecutions, for vindictive prosecutions. We have not seen this except maybe under J. Edgar Hoover, 48 years as FBI director, did do illegal wiretaps, etc. But for the most part, the Justice Department calls balls and strikes based on fact and law, doesn't use it, to go after political enemies. So I saw this as Joe Biden realizing, whoa, I need to do something to protect against that violation of norms. It's stepping up to address that. We all know he would have been bullseye on his back. And he's also not the first person to pardon a family member. Bill Clinton pardoned his brother, and Trump pardoned his son's father-in-law.
Donald Nixon, I want to say. Yeah. So look, I agree with all of that, but it also leads us right into, it's just leaving everything aside. If somebody got punishment that the DOJ normally wouldn't dole out, and we haven't gotten into all the complications of there being a special counsel and that being outside the supervisory structure of the DOJ, but certainly it does seem to me that that description put somebody in the heartland of a possible pardon. But it also, this notion of the threats that Trump has issued. We just saw today, I don't know if you were following, it's not from Trump, but how the House committee is trying to go after Liz Cheney and refer her for investigation. Anyway, the thing that is most on people's minds now is whether Biden, before he leaves, would try to do what you've described as a prophylactic measure, but writ large to so many of the people whom Trump and Patel and others have said, we're going after them when we get in. I think of this as largely a political problem and a very difficult one. But let me start by asking you, do you see any that it's sort of perspective, that it's has to be loosely described to keep them from coming up with a new theory? Do you see anything that is problematic as a matter of legal power? And actually, let me just ask you to then, if you were advising the president, who supposedly is, thinking about this daily, how to frame these things, what would you say? But obviously that's a two-part question. So let's start with the first.
Well, I'm on record on this one too. I did an op-ed with Norm Eisen and Richard Painter in Newsweek a couple weeks ago. I think desperate times require desperate measures, and President Biden is president for a few weeks remaining, and it is an unfettered power, and we are heading into treacherous waters for folks. And to use that power to protect people who participated in the system of justice, whether it be through the January 6th committee or in connection with the various trials, to use the pardon to protect them, to me seems like something that should be on the table. I mean, I can talk about the critiques and the pushback on that, that it would create this revolving door of pardons, that it gives Donald Trump the green light to just pardon everybody that commits crimes on his behalf. I mean, I don't think Donald Trump needs Joe Biden to give him any ideas in that regard. The Supreme Court, in creating immunity, already laid that groundwork. Immunity lets him commit crimes, and the pardon lets him have co-conspirators and accomplices commit crimes on behalf. And I said that long before even the Hunter Biden pardon. That was created by the immunity decision. And we know Donald Trump, even in his first administration, tried to politicize the Justice Department. And, his career prosecutors, in addition to his attorneys general, said no. As far as how to frame it, I see it more as an amnesty type pardon, a clemency pardon, similar to what Jimmy Carter did.
With the draft dodgers.
Right. Rather than identify with specific people, because the idea is none of these folks committed any crimes. And so it would be an amnesty pardon, to establish and ensure that they can walk around protected by the rule of law's acceptance of innocence, and not using the Justice Department and the criminal law enforcement apparatus to intimidate and bully people. Another argument will be, well, let the judicial system just work. Judges know how to do this. Special counsel John Durham, did this quasi-failed investigation, investigating the investigators in the Mueller report. He had, 3 indictments, 2 of them flopped at trial. The third was a guilty plea for changing an email that was attached to some kind of surveillance application. But the problem, this, Harry, it's expensive. It's expensive to hire criminal defense lawyers. I saw this firsthand when I was in the Whitewater investigation under Ken Starr, and Bill Clinton had lied about his affair with Monica Lewinsky and other things. And, they called low-level, regular, people in the White House that were not making a lot of money, moms and dads or young people out of college. And you had to get somebody to prep you for the grand jury. You have to sit there. It's expensive. And if you're not an actual target, no one's reimbursing you. So the fact of being swept up in that can ruin lives. And so I think it needs to be given very very, very careful consideration. And I have already put my thumb on the scale in favor of doing that, on the idea that it minimizes harm, even though it's not going to protect everybody. And it will be certainly, a political cudgel against the Democrats. But at this point, I just think we're in for such rough times moving forward with this president and what he's promised, that I think we should use whatever's left of the power of the rule of law to minimize the damage.
Yeah, I mean, that is the way to present it. I agree. And, the cudgel, it's, I think, folly to think that he will not use it or will forbear if they don't do these sorts of pardons. And as you've described it, you're right. It's unusual, maybe unprecedented, because you've never had a president so nakedly say, I'm just going to go after people who, I don't like what they said. Somebody, I don't like Ray because he said maybe it was shrapnel, not a bullet, which he never, it's really remarkably petty and immature. But still, let me push on you. So let's say we've gone, and there's all kinds of things on the other side for the reasons you said. And in general, it's an interesting time in any administration. You mentioned Mark Rich. That was the very end of Clinton. You mentioned Caspar Weinberger, very end of Bush. And there's always the worry that it will change and even tarnish the overall legacy. And that's a possibility here. But I always come back to, what are the facts? And, it just is true that none of these people have committed crimes, and mercy is, and that they're looking at a kind of reign of terror. But let me push on you a little bit more, Kim, in terms of form. So I think the distinction you were making in invoking the Carter amnesty for draft dodgers was between identification of particular people and particular crimes and something that's more generic. So literally, let me ask you, the president would like to see you now or the White House counsel. How shall the proclamation or the legal document be framed? Have you thought it through down, to specific language? And if you haven't, it's fine.
Yeah.
But obviously there's going to be a potential fight about it. So
no, I haven't thought about it personally down to particular language, but I think if it were up to me, I would not identify specific people. I mean, Kash Patel has an enemies list.
So you might refer to the enemies list. You just wouldn't name the 22 people or whatever.
I would probably name the category of people, maybe, anyone who's been threatened, or anyone on Kash Patel's enemies list, or anyone in certain categories that have participated in investigations of Donald Trump, right? So witnesses, that's a big concern. Imagine, this, Donald Trump's going to get all the DOJ files of, both the Mar-a-Lago investigation and the January 6th. There are people that were called to testify before the grand jury or just had interviews with the FBI. They're bound under 18 U.S.C. 1001 to tell the truth. So they told the truth. Donald Trump's going to know all these people, right? All of their names, whoever they are. It could be the secretary, right? It could be the custodian who saw something.
And it could be Mark Meadows, who did testify and has kept it quiet. That's right.
It could be Mark Meadows.
And when you look at his list, the former allies on the list are remarkable, right? Bill Barr's on the list, or Comey's on the list, or Merrick Garland, but yes.
Right. You could say those people, some of them will get some measure of immunity. There's prosecutorial immunity. Immunity is really about civil actions being sued, but I think there's a pretty strong argument that there'd be some measure of immunity for a guy like Jack Smith.
But you got to litigate and you got to spend money, right?
Exactly.
Jack Smith's a career public servant. Yeah.
Yeah. And you've got a Supreme Court that's very pro-Trump, and they might find a little loophole for Donald Trump. You've got immunity for members of Congress under the speech and debate clause. But again, that's only if they're legislating. Mark Meadows lost that argument in connection with the criminal investigation and indictment down in Georgia, and arguably it doesn't apply to crimes. A member of Congress can commit a crime in connection with their legislative duties. We've seen members of Congress be prosecuted and criminally convicted. So, but those people are very high profile. They might get lawyers, defense, nonprofits coming forward pro bono for them. So so if you look at the Carter pardon, he defined it by a number of years, as did Joe Biden in the Hunter Biden pardon. I think that was the signal that he's worried about prosecutors finding a crime, right? Normally, as you know, prosecutors look at the evidence and ask themselves, is there enough to charge and convict beyond a reasonable doubt? Otherwise, we move on. We know this is a really bad guy, but, it's not finding the crime. It's looking to see if there's something that's chargeable and that we exercise our discretion and decide, should we do it? So I think it's almost like drafting it legislatively to capture the people that are most at risk for having taken a stand in favor of the rule of law and in a way that's antithetical to Donald Trump's interest. I think that's the way that I would do it.
And I'll just add, and by telling the truth. This happened to me with the whole LA Times resignation, but every time you push on any issue, there's always a lie at bottom with Trump, and just standing up for the truth, it seems always to be, fighting back against him. Okay, so I think I have a sense of your general views, and you did write the op-ed that said, extreme times call for extreme measures, and how that would be framed. We'll see whether one of the things to do is wordsmithing to try to keep some future DOJ that Donald Trump, because he's now been green-lighted to do this, calls up and using his core powers and says, I don't give a shit. I want you to find a crime. We'll see how that would go.
Right, and that's how the pardon question would get to the Supreme Court. Right, someone gets a pardon, and he goes after him anyway. That's the person that has standing.
Exactly. Okay, but also, as you say, the person who is put through the ringer, investigated, spends $500,000, and then they drop it. They don't have standing, right, at that point. All right, let's just take in the few minutes we have left to focus in a little on January 20th and after, and the promise, I think, starting in the first day of pardoning some of the January 6th goons who charged the Capitol. My sense from what you said so far, Kim, is it may stink to high heaven, but there's little to be done about it. But I don't want to be presumptuous. Give me your anticipatory thoughts toward that kind of action by Trump.
I don't think there's anything to be done about it. I do think this falls in the first category of pardoning people that are going to go on to potentially be violent. And that's really problematic. There was a survey done this summer of people, both Democrats and Republicans, on whether the January 6th pardon should go forward. A majority on both sides of the aisle said no for that very reason. We don't want to green light political violence. And I don't think people also understand. So these folks, if they're in prison, they'd get out. That's similar to a commutation, but a pardon also restores rights. It restores access to guns. It restores the ability to be in the military. It restores certain kinds of job prospects, both at the state and federal government level. It might restore benefits that would be on the taxpayer dime. So the implications for regular people are beyond just the violence question. Now, Donald Trump might say, especially if Joe Biden does the prospective type pardon, the amnesty pardon, it's really wouldn't amnesty. This is amnesty too, because I am, these called them patriots and hostages, but there's a big difference.
Right. Heroes.
Heroes. Yeah. The folks under the Joe Biden idea are innocent. These people are guilty. They committed crimes, and they committed violence crimes. And on the Biden side, and frankly, for people like you and me, which is why I appreciate having this opportunity to have the conversation, is educating people about the difference and not allowing the spin to get out ahead of this, that, pardons can be used to override crimes in very serious ways that are dangerous to people and dangerous to the rule of law and dangerous to the Constitution and dangerous to democracy. And for Donald Trump, in these pardons to say, I forgive what happened on January 6th. I forgive violence to overthrow an election, take it away from the people with force, and threaten the entire United States Congress and all of the staffers, ensure that, force them to run for their lives. I endorse a gallows being erected on the Capitol to hang Mike Pence. I endorse all the lies about the big lie. That is a chilling concept, but it's a chilling concept that, frankly, a majority of Americans appear to be comfortable with as of, November 5th, 2024.
Yeah. Or at least indifferent towards, and it's really true. But I'll just say, when you push and push, when you just get to the end, there's a lie. It's always Trump. There's a fact. And if people sort of just knew the facts, but this is something that transpired in front of them, maybe the most serious crime against the Constitution, single in our history, the biggest DOJ operation ever. And of course, Trump is, I think, on the horns of a dilemma here, because he said things like, well, he'll maybe pardon the nonviolent offenders. But as you said, these are heroes and patriots. You would think no one more heroic and patriotic than the head of the proud, than Stuart Rhodes, the guy with the, there's some deep kind of contradiction here, but we are about to be living a deep governmental contradiction. Anyway, thank you so much, Kim, and really illuminated things. And I hope, in particular, if we see these kinds of wholesale pardons from Trump, maybe we can talk again and get our hands around what's objectionable and separate the law from the politics. But the whole thing, pardons are now front and center in a way that, as you say, is, pretty unsettling.
Yeah, well, great to be with you, Harry. Anytime.
Thank you for tuning in to One on One, a weekly conversation series from Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts, and please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we post full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. Talking Feds remains one of the very few independent productions out there, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. Plus, you'll get tons of perks like free access to my LA Times op-eds and the chance to join monthly live Q&A sessions. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the feds will keep talking. Talking Feds One-on-One is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producer Gabriella Glick, sound engineering by Matt McArdle, Rosie Dawn Griffin, Hamza Mehendranathan, David Lieberman, and Emma Maynard are our contributing writers. Production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Genesis Magpayo. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.